Hi, Audrey.
Hi.
Hi,
How are
Audrey.
you?
Sorry, I was in another meeting, but I just
That's
opened
okay.
it up. I'm letting everybody else, I'm not admitting them till you guys let me know when I can admit them.
Okay, did you want to stop that recording and then start it again, or
Yeah, that makes more sense.
usually that's what Ivy does. She doesn't start it till everybody's in and then,
Yeah, and I didn't even start it, so it must have just been set to start as soon as it was opened, but I'll stop it.
so thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar today from the Healthy Productive Worker Partnership, Education Worker Mental Health. Where do we go from here? And we know for many of you it is March break, and we appreciate the time you're spending with your family. So we hope we have a productive hour and some good discussion here today. So just to introduce our team next. So my name is Dr. Kristen Ferguson, and I'm a professor at Nipissing University in the Schulich School of Education. And we also have Melissa Corrente. She is a research associate from the University of Ottawa and the trainee network co-lead for the Healthy Productive Worker Partnership. And we also have Susan Roger. She is a psychologist and professor at the Faculty of Education at Western University. So Melissa and I are joining you today from North Bay, Ontario. So we'll begin with an land acknowledgement. As we begin this webinar today, I would like to acknowledge that we are in the territory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, and that the land on which we gather is the Nipissing First Nation traditional territory and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. We respect and are grateful to hold this event on these lands with all our relations. So first, just to break the ice a little bit, to give us a bit of perspective. So some laughter. So on the left here, we have, a meme from Toy Story. Here's your classroom. You have 31 students, spread the desks as far out as you can, and make sure they all keep their masks on at all times. But most importantly, have fun. And we know after March break, that's all changing again, because as teachers, that big word pivot has been on our minds for the past 2 years. And on the right-hand side, me awkwardly waiting for kids to turn on their mic and video when I call on them. So all of our teacher colleagues and friends who have been teaching online this year and throughout the pandemic. So just an outline of what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to start with a story. Then we're going to review some of the research findings from the Healthy Productive Worker Partnership. We're going to provide some context for teacher mental health and educator mental health. And we'd also like to say that we are welcoming all educators today, whether you're an EA, an ECE, or any other position within the school system, we welcome you. We're also going to talk about trauma within the education system, promising practices, and have some discussion. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Melissa Corrente.
Thanks very much, Kristen. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. I wanted to start with a story. So I listened to many educators tell their story. Each was powerful in its own way. And I want to thank each educator who took the time to speak with me. So storytelling gives us an opportunity to learn from another person's experience, and it can strengthen, shape, and challenge our opinions and values. So I offer John's story to share with you today as a way to connect and rally for change. We want an education system that values and supports educators, not just because it benefits students. So just to give you a little bit of context. So John has been a teacher for 17 years, and his partner is also a teacher. They spent their time teaching in the Middle East at the beginning of their careers, before they came and returned to Canada to teach. They have 2 teenage daughters, and they help care for their aging parents. So John's the department head at his school, and he's heavily involved in extracurricular activities. And he spends about 60 hours a week on teaching related tasks and about 4 hours on extracurriculars, where he volunteers his time. So John says the time he spends with the kids in his classroom is the best part of his day, hands down. The pandemic and teaching virtually almost caused John to take a stress leave. He described sitting in his car in the parking lot, crying and talking to his doctor because he was so overwhelmed and upset with how things were going at school and then virtually. And he said, I feel kind of broken. I feel like this semester has drained me of my ability to be creative and productive. And I'm finding it hard to focus on the end of the semester right now. My joy is being in the room with the kids, and you don't get any of that experience in Microsoft Teams. So John didn't end up taking a leave of absence because he had a hard time saying that it was just his job. For him, it was really a love. And he mentioned the stigma involved with taking a leave of absence, and he looked at it as kind of being a failure. And he didn't want to admit that, well, other people are handling it, why can't I? He didn't want to admit that there was something wrong with him, and he felt that the school boards in general have an invasive and punitive HR policy. So John said if he took a stress leave, he might become a target in the future, and he didn't want to be quote unquote watched throughout the rest of his time as a teacher. So he said he felt supported on a union level, but not particularly at a school system level. So when I asked John, you know, what do you foresee? What do you see being successful moving forward? And he just said that he wanted to give teachers permission to slow down, to cover less curriculum content, and to make feedback more meaningful, and to really focus on connecting with kids. He believed that smaller class sizes and covering less material in courses in secondary would take a whole lot of pressure off. So I shared John's story with you as a way to connect. I'm sure some of his story resonates with some of you. And I found every story I heard resonated on some level. So that's just to provide a little bit of context. So we could spend this whole presentation just strictly talking about the research and the study and what we found, but I really want to just give you a kind of an overview of the context of the research so that we can dive into a deeper discussion about teacher mental health and how we can move forward from here. So we had three different methods that we used. So our stakeholder interviews were really conducted to obtain a macro view of education and what's going on. So we talked to associations, we talked to federations, we talked to different employers. We also touched on pre-service education, and we talked to some experts in the field. We conducted an online survey, and we had just over 1,000 responses, which we were obviously hoping for more, but due to the pandemic, there was a lot of survey fatigue going on. The majority of our respondents were from Ontario and Quebec, and this included educators in elementary, secondary, junior high, ECEs, EAs, and vocational education. And then the education worker interviews were conducted with 53 participants between September 2020 and July 2021. And each interview varied in length, anywhere from 30 to 35 minutes, right up to 90 minutes or even 100 minutes, depending on how much the person had to say. And they were all conducted either by phone or by Zoom. So just to give you an overview of some of the stakeholder findings, some of the experts that we chatted with, teacher stress and anxiety were obviously exacerbated through COVID, no surprise there. And there was a real theme of things not being sustainable moving forward. If we continue to go the way we're going, it's not going to be sustainable. And there was a real vibe that systemic changes are needed. So those individual interventions like doing yoga and offering wellness initiatives are not enough to keep teachers going. So those are just some of the general findings. And there was not a whole lot of gender differences noticed among stakeholders. The main ones were childcare and caregiving were mentioned more by women, and that men tend to isolate themselves and wait till their mental health is more severe before reaching out for help. As far as our online survey, so the survey was open between November 2020 and May 2021. And it really focuses on the experiences of educators with their mental health, leaves of absence, return to work, as well as issues related to presenteeism, burnout, and the impact that COVID had. So we had our responses, 83% were female and 17% were men. And 53% of respondents reported having experienced a mental health issue during their career. 61% of those made a change to their work, and 68% considered taking a leave of absence. And so it was very interesting to look across the different professions. We looked at 7 different professions, and in education, we reported the highest percentage of workers who took a leave of absence. So the top three sources of work stress were work overload, which is kind of multiple demands and deadlines. So it was not just the quantity of work that educators were doing, but also the intensity of the work that they were doing. Number two was digital stress. And number three was poor relations with management. So these were the top three sources of stress prior to COVID. And then if we look at during COVID, the sources of stress were the same, but digital stress moved into that number one spot, which is not surprising with the virtual teaching that educators were doing. This is a fun little graph that just shows the experience of teachers before COVID and then during. So if you look at the purple bar there, that represents education workers. So before COVID-19, education workers were occasionally burned out. But during COVID, you can see that obviously it's gone up quite a bit with educators experiencing one or more symptoms of burnout. So when we talk about burnout, we're talking about things like exhaustion, kind of negative feelings or cynicism towards one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. So when I looked at all of the interviews that were conducted and some of the themes that came out from the educators themselves, social isolation was definitely a theme that was found. As far as individual mental health, educators were really missing their family and friends, as most of us were. And teaching from home really reduced that adult interaction that we are so accustomed to. Parents particularly struggled, especially with having children at home while also trying to teach virtually was a huge stress for parents. Trying to keep everyone safe and healthy and reducing one's exposure led to a lot of stress for parents. There was a real notion of feeling disconnected. So educators felt separated from their colleagues. Most staff rooms were empty, and there was really no socials being held outside of school hours, you know, where you get together with your colleagues after work to kind of commiserate or chat about what's going well, what's not going well. So just really feeling disconnected, not only from colleagues, but also from students as well. Obviously with COVID, there was a lot of discussion about the PPE and the cleaning protocols, so sanitizing equipment and just trying to find time during the day to make sure that students and that staff were safe. So it was a lot of time consuming there. And also teachers were having to move with all of their stuff on a trolley instead of moving classes. So teachers were the ones moving around instead of the students. There were some positive lights in the interviews with teachers. So there were some who experienced work improvements through COVID. So there are a lot of teachers who are expected to go to multiple schools. And so COVID kind of forced them to stay within one school. So they felt less pressure to travel. They had more time to spend with individual students, which they noticed a huge improvement in their work, made things a little bit easier. And some actually enjoyed teaching virtually. So it gave them a break from saying, please put your mask on properly. Please put your mask on properly. So it alleviated some of that face-to-face stress that teachers faced. I don't want to say overall it was positive, but there was positive pockets for some educators that I talked to. The lack of training was also a theme. So learning new platforms was challenging for educators, a lack of technological support, and trying to help students who were struggling with technology was also challenging. The workload increased. So this was noted more particularly in secondary with quadmesters. So this changed the amount of work that educators were expected to do in each semester. And obviously the virtual teaching required a lot of extra content creation for many educators, which impacted how many hours they were spending per day on their job. The impact of leadership was huge. So administrators were not always flexible working with educators who were off on a leave of absence or wanted to return to work. And the level of support often dictated the type of experience that someone had. And this is very prevalent in just some direct quotes from participants. So in my career, I've worked at 100 different schools. It would be 100 different experiences. Everything trickles down from the top. And I think it's really hard as a teacher to admit that you don't have everything under control. So there was a lot of themes of leadership throughout that leadership, they really set the tone for the school environment. And a supportive principal or vice principal was definitely noted as either an enabler to taking a leave of absence and returning to work successfully, whereas an unsupportive administrative staff were discussed as really a barrier to taking a leave of absence. And it often led educators to take multiple leaves of absence. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Susan, to chat about what sets teaching apart. Why is teaching so different?
All right, thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks everybody for joining us to talk about this really important topic. Now, I'm the only one among us who is not a teacher. Did try that when I graduated from university 1,000 years ago. You didn't have to have a teaching certificate to supply teach. And so I lasted 3 days and vowed I would never do that again. I was completely inadequate. But I became a psychologist and a school psychologist. I was in a school psychology role at the Thames Valley Board for a number of years. And now I am privileged to have a career doing research with education workers, teaching the only mandatory course in the country to our Bachelor of Education students, the only mandatory course in the country on mental health, and we include their mental health within that course. So I'm really excited to talk with you about these things. And what is it about teaching? I mean, I'm sure you all have much more fulsome lists than I do. These are the ones that I really notice, though, that bring on that sense of overwhelmedness in teachers. And you know, that first one is being the expert. So what I mean here is that this profession, you know, you get hired and day one you walk into your classroom and you are totally in responsibility for that. As soon as you walk in, there's no on-ramp here. They have so much supervision when they're doing their teacher education degree. And here you're on your own. And I mean, they do get some essential mentorship in Ontario with things like NTEP, but now they are expected to be experts in child development, pedagogy, curriculum, behavior. I mean, there's just all kinds of things. And they also have to be the expert when it comes to communicating with parents who often, as I've heard, do not always regard the teacher as an expert because everybody's been to school. So I guess, you know, many people think that they know how to do this job. And there's a different level of public critique for teachers, I think, than there are for other professional knowledge workers like physicians and nurses. And I think the other thing is that things do change so quickly, as Melissa said, right? So you're constantly chasing these changing expectations, policies, new curricula coming out, you know, at this point in what's going on in our province, and often with very short notice. The other thing is being in the classroom. So all of the time, or most of the time, supervising and teaching in your classroom. You can be quite isolated, and especially if you're teaching the young ones, you can't leave them alone. One of my daughters is a teacher. Her very first job was full day kindergarten. And at the end of the first term, I said, so what have you learned? And she said, how not to go to the bathroom for an entire day. Because that just wasn't possible for her, right? In overcrowded school, not enough teachers. For those who teach the little ones, there's a need for lots of organization to keep everybody going, right? And I mean, it's different. You got different challenges if you're in high school. Being responsible to be judged for your classroom's behavior, if they're too noisy, or if they're not responsive enough to your direction. Of course, acting in loco parentis is something that many workers don't have to deal with. This being responsible for the child's mental, emotional, physical well-being, as well as their cognitive development and their learning, and getting to know and develop this relationship of trust and have that duty of care. Finally, the last one I've included here is emotional labor. And I'm just going to quickly define it for those of you who are not familiar. Sometimes we call it moral distress, but it really is when we are required to work in ways that don't always align with our personal values. And so it is things like when there's a big pivot and all of a sudden we're teaching online and the children are upset and the parents are upset, and teachers are required to say, no, we got this. It's going to be okay. All the while, being very nervous about that pivot. So that emotional labor takes a lot of energy to manage. And then we're doing all of this in the presence of the myths, like, well, we get summers off. Teachers get summers off. They only work from 8:30 to 2:30. And you have to deal with that too. Okay, so I want to take just a quick minute before we start talking about wellness strategies and talk about maybe why it's so hard, right? We talk about self-care because it's not an instinct for humans. Our instinct is to make sure everybody else is okay before us. So we really have to pay some very direct attention to self-care and wellness. And one of the reasons is that, when we look at traditional theories of child development, and I'm thinking here of guys like Erikson and Piaget, they taught us that the sooner kids can do things by themselves, like walk and feed themselves and regulate their own emotions and be independent, that was good human development. Where more contemporary ways of thinking, people like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and Jean Baker Miller talk about relational development, where our goals include being a good listener, being a good friend, right? Which is a whole different set of skills. And we want to be somebody who's good at co-regulation. We want our kids to be attuned to self and others, but we don't often get chances, especially early in our life, to develop those skills. So these are some of the reasons why I think this whole thing about wellness is hard. Okay, so let's talk about some strategies though. Remembering that wellness is not just the absence of illness, but the presence of good health. And it is a process that we have to think about, right? It's iterative. We have to notice ourselves, what's going on. We have to face up to it, which is not always easy. I know that one from experience. We have to reflect on it. We have to ask for support, make a plan, be accountable, and then iterate, right? See how it went, see if we need to make any changes. And a lot of the research that's done in wellness strategies, intervention programs for schools, they do it somewhere else and then they try to apply it to schools. So if you're working at IBM and they have a wellness policy or a wellness program for the employees where everybody goes off at 2 o'clock every Monday and does yoga, or everybody is involved in a nutrition program where we're learning some new recipes, we all gather in the lunchroom, those things just aren't possible for teachers, right? So most of the wellness strategies will be things that teachers are being asked to do on their own, which is really hard to prioritize that time, right? So context matters, and the teaching life is a very different kind of life than others. So, and they don't always apply. And here I'm thinking of drink 8 glasses of water a day. That's good for wellness, right? Well, if my daughter had been drinking 8 glasses of water a day and then couldn't go to the bathroom all day because she was with the little ones, that wouldn't have been such a great thing, right? So we really have to think, is this like an evidence, but what kind of evidence is out there to support these strategies? And B, is it possible for me to do? So one of the things I think we can do when we think about this well-being as a process, we can figure out what we want to target. We can share our goals with someone who we trust, and we can be accountable to each other. We can practice self-empathy. So if your goal, we call them growing edges in psychology, places where you want to learn and develop. If my growing edge is that I want to learn more about my health and how to have good health and practice good health habits, I want to practice self-empathy and not beat myself up if I end up having nachos for dinner one night, right? So it's really important to have that self-empathy, that non-judgmental awareness that we would give to everybody else, right? We're not going to blame a child for not bringing a nutritious lunch. We're not going to blame our coworker for being unable to engage in a conversation because they're really upset. We're going to be non-judgmental. Some of the things that we know are that, oh, not yet, sorry, Melissa. Some of the things that we know are finding humor and joy and awe in our day helps. So when you're on your way home from work, that transition time, think of 3 things that happened that day. So let your thoughts of work on your way home not be consumed with what didn't work, what didn't happen, mistakes you think you made, mistakes you think others made, but let it be filled with, let me think about the great stuff that happened today. And doing that on a consistent basis can flip the script in our brain so we more automatically go that way. We can, remember that we have such a big influence on students. And I think that's a really important thing. As Maya Angelou said, they're not going to remember what you said, but they will remember how you made them
feel.
Yeah. Okay, so next slide, please. Thanks, Melissa. All right, so I wanted to provide some context because I think we're all pretty clear that all of this evidence is coming together to paint a very consistent picture. So in our survey that we did for this project, we administered something called the K6, which is a scale that measures people's mental distress and their the level of that distress as it relates to impairment that they might be experiencing on an everyday basis. And we found that, and you've heard these results before, we found that before the pandemic, people's distress level was in that moderate area, right? It was stuff like, okay, if we make a few changes, if we get some support, we'll be able to do this. Whereas after, or during, I should say, the pandemic, when it was done again, it was in that really worrisome area of mental distress. It was much higher. And this is congruent with what they found in the BC Teachers Survey too. So the BC Teachers Survey that was done in 2020 to 2021 found the same thing, that it was much higher during the pandemic. The Alberta teachers did a really interesting project. I don't know if you're familiar with it. They interviewed 10 people really in an in-depth kind of way in a project called COVID-19 Caregiving and Careers. So they were really looking at how people were handling this emotional load, and it's the constantly changing guidelines that people were talking about, the shortage of occasional teachers, the work intensification. It wasn't just more work, it was more scope of work that they had to handle. Emotional labor, that teachers were having to reassure students all the time that things were going to be okay. And parents. Professional demands were impacting their home life, and the ability to reconcile work and home life became impossible. And I think that's one of the really interesting things. We have always thought about work-life balance as being the responsibility of the teacher, not the system. And it's pretty hard to have work-life balance if you're the only one, if that fulcrum is right underneath you, right? And there's no balance coming from the other side. So I think these are all really important things, because when you look at the interventions that we do have out there, they're all about how do we make education workers more resilient? How do we make education workers care more, be more flexible, be better time managers, right? And I think back to, in policy studies, there's a woman called Carol Bacci, and she's developed this framework. And her first question to any policy is, what's the problem represented to be, and who represents that problem? So in this case, for a lot of those things I just mentioned, the problem is represented to be the teachers, and the people representing those problems are the system, right? So we're not going to get a whole lot of helpful research on work-life balance until the system also takes some responsibility. The Canadian Teachers Federation, I imagine that many of you, most of you, or all of you have seen this study at about what, but at what cost. They just did the big OTF conference. They surveyed 2,300 teachers in a really high quality study. They did, so they surveyed 2,300 education workers, and then they did interviews with 32. And again, they're finding these same themes: deteriorating mental health among education workers, people being pulled in multiple directions, having that omnipresent sense of crisis, of emergency, of I'm just scrambling to try to keep up, and that they can't meet anybody's needs. So again, we're seeing these same surveys. And the BC teacher survey that I mentioned, they had 1,200 teachers that they surveyed. Deteriorating mental health, fewer opportunities to connect with students, feeling alone, feeling that the unmet needs for the students were their biggest concern, a workload increase, and very interestingly, when they felt more support from their colleagues, their school, and their school leaders, were more able to handle the stress. And all of them reported they reported lots of support from their federations, their schools, and their school leaders and their colleagues, but not very much support from the Ministry of Education and their school board. So really connecting that piece of, if you feel like you've got some support, you've got some better outcomes in terms of how you're responding to the stress. They noted that 40% of their participants were more likely to leave the profession than to stay. 67% reported they were working more or a lot more from before the pandemic. And 70% were worried about the needs of their students from vulnerable backgrounds compared to before the pandemic, which leads nicely into some work that Prachi Srivastava, a colleague of mine from the Faculty of Education at Western, they did a study looking at, how many is it? 3,994 publicly funded schools in Ontario, and concluded that socioeconomic characteristics of the geographic location of the schools were more important in determining the cumulative impact of COVID, school, infections for kids, lockdowns, poor outcomes, than individual school characteristics. So again, we have systemic problems here. If you're a high needs school in a high needs neighborhood, you're going to need more support, right? Not just the same support as the other kids get. And so messages, this is happening everywhere. We're seeing the same kinds of patterns of results. And we are constantly seeing that how important the school level is, but also how important the system level is when it comes to support and how that impacts teachers and education workers as a whole. Okay. Go to the next one. Yeah. Here's our question for you in chat box. In the last 2 years, have you considered taking a leave of absence or leaving the profession? people can connect in a satisfactory way to chat box. How many of the teachers I speak to on a regular basis would say this is true of them? Thank you, Kim, in the chat, who's sharing she's new to the profession. It says she's already covered 2 leaves of absences. It's interesting, right? And it's interesting that how that impacts the whole school. As the absences for people who how the school is able to resource that. So lots of schools having a third or more of their teachers gone on a daily basis because of their symptoms or their child's symptoms. And how that shifts everything. So special ed teachers getting pulled into a classroom. So those kids who are going to get targeted reading help are not getting it. Things like that. Yeah. So one of the ways, I mean, when we think of moving ahead, how do we take what we know and move ahead and do something different that might be helpful? I think about trauma, right? Both the trauma experiences we and our students have had before the pandemic started and the ones that have happened since. So trauma, simply put, is an experience of and a response to a negative event or series of events that threaten our safety, our life, or our integrity. That is, the stress of whatever trauma it is overwhelms our ability to cope, right? It's more than everyday stress. It's something that impacts our daily living. And I love the way that Judith Herman talks about it, because she says trauma is an expected response to an unexpected event, right? So I want you to think about some of the children and youth that you've taught, and you see them come into the classroom and they're not able to concentrate. They get startled by a loud noise. They never look where you want them to be looking, and they can't focus on the page in front of them. Well, in my experience working with children and youth who have experienced abuse, have a great deal of trouble with hypervigilance. So they notice things that affect their safety. So back in the old days, I can remember a young boy telling me that when he walked into his family's living room, he immediately looked to make sure that TV Guide was on the table beside his dad's chair, because if it wasn't, then he would be in big trouble, right? So he was always looking for that thing to be in place. He wasn't noticing anything else. He wasn't noticing who else was in the room. He wasn't noticing what's going on, because noticing that that TV Guide was there was really important to his survival, right? In a school situation, if they're reading a story, say about, going on a visit to their grandmother, we work with lots of families that are disconnected and where there's a great deal of conflict, so they can wander off attention-wise, because now they're thinking about what happened in their family. They're not thinking about the story at all. So it interferes with, it impacts and impairs a person's daily ability to function. And we hear words like shock and terror and shame and powerlessness used. And you might be thinking, so what does trauma have to do with a whole school system? Well, research that came out not too long ago reported that in Canada, in a retrospective sample of about 10,000 Canadians, 76% of Canadian adults said that they had experienced trauma in their lifetimes. And we know the experience, the prevalence of child abuse and neglect in Canada as well. So we're not talking about something that doesn't happen very often, right? So the trauma model that I'm going to talk about says these are the ways that we can help ourselves, our colleagues, and our students learn and be, even if they've had a trauma experience, right? Because, an experience of trauma will affect how people regulate their emotions. If you as a child have never been able to trust someone because the people you trusted hurt you, they're not going to develop a great relationship with their teacher either, unless that teacher is really patient and takes a lot of time and understands that the fact that this kid doesn't seem to connect with them isn't the kid's fault, right? It impacts our self-perceptions. Very often people who experience trauma are all or nothing thinkers. So we're going to think of the ways that trauma and violence happen. We're going to create safe environments. We're going to foster connection, choice, and collaboration, and adopt a strength-based strategy. These are the things that we're going to do. Is there another slide on this topic, or I can't remember? Oh, not just, yeah, there's that one. I'll just tell you before we talk real quick about that one, is that when we talk about how to be trauma and violence informed, we're talking about interpersonal trauma, like child abuse and maltreatment, like intimate partner violence. We're talking about situational violence, like being somewhere where you're caught in a war, or being homeless, or being a victim of crime, being a refugee. We also talk about systemic violence, so experiences of racial discrimination, poverty, and historical violence, right? Having for example, the experience of our Indigenous members. So what we want to do, what we can do, and this is taken, this model of trauma and violence informed care has been demonstrated to be very effective in the healthcare setting. We are now developing it for the education setting. I did some research last year, which I can give you the reference for, where our students in the BEd course, once they learned about trauma and violence informed care, were able to change their attitudes about kids' behavior and the reasons for that behavior. One of the things that we have is a set of tools. We have a trauma walkthrough, so that we can figure out what the school is like for a student or an education worker walking in when that person has a trauma experience. It also helps us think about vicarious trauma. So this is just simply the application model for how we go about deciding if our school or our system, our classroom, if we're ready to try this trauma-informed care. So we explore, we commit, we set the foundation, we adapt it to fit our particular circumstances. So this is not a one-size-fits-all model. We take some actions, we follow up to see if they changed, and we keep doing more of the stuff that worked, and we do less of the stuff that doesn't work. Okay, that's it. I went over, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So we're going to have this chat for a minute, but before we move on, I know some of our official partners for the project are on the call. So I just wanted to take a minute to formally thank the Canadian Teachers Federation and the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, who supported us in our study and shared our survey and all that social media work they did in helping and promoting our work. We thank you. And we also thank the affiliate organizations and associations and federations who also shared our work. I know many of you are on the call too. So even all those tweets and all those little things that you did to help us with the research, we greatly appreciate your support and partnership. So thank you. So promising practices, Melissa, this is one of your favorite questions. Did you want to discuss this one?
Sure. So one question that I asked every participant that I interviewed is, if you had a magic wand and you could do anything with that magic wand, what would you do? What would you do to improve educator mental health? So there's a whole variety of responses that we've received, which we'll touch on in a minute, but I would love to hear in the chat, if each of you listening right now had that magic wand and you could wave it and do whatever you think would improve educator mental health, what would you do with that magic wand? So I'll give you a minute if you want to type in the chat, and then we'll share what we heard from our participants.
If anyone would prefer, you can raise your hand and we can do a discussion this way too. But we have one in the chat box already. Vote in a government that supports public education and values educators in consultation, which is an interesting time in Ontario. And there's other jurisdictions on the call today too. So yeah, absolutely. Take away grading of some subjects like gym, drama, art, and let it be for fun. Yes. And I saw there was a call on Facebook I saw the other day about trying to get rid of the EQAO testing again this year. And I hear it's all going to be online, and what a year for that. That will be our obsession with assessment for everything. I agree with that. The arts for sure. Want to go ahead, Melissa?
So we heard a lot of really great suggestions from educators from all across Canada. So these are just highlighted some of the things that we heard about the magic wand question. So obviously smaller class sizes is a huge ask. More teachers, EAs and ECEs in each room. Wellness-driven PD sessions, or even just teacher-driven PD sessions. So if you're going to mandate teachers to have PD, allow them to have the ownership and let them choose what they're going to do. Focus on administrator well-being. So that theme that we saw with leadership, kind of setting the tone for the school, is our leadership in the schools properly trained and prepared to deal with the mental health of the teachers in the school and the educators in the school? I read an interesting article called the value of subtraction. So as humans, our nature is to continually add onto our plates. What more can we add? So one thing that we thought of and that we heard from educators is to subtract some things off of teachers' plates rather than adding on. So subtracting something simple like recess duty, lunch duty, bus duty, and allowing community volunteers to do those 15, 20-minute positions to give teachers a chance to kind of sit back, reflect, plan, do things they need to do during the day, go to the bathroom. Expanding EAP programs to provide more counseling or therapy sessions. We heard from a lot of educators who accessed the EAP program. They got set up with a really great counselor, and then after a couple sessions, their money had run out. So they developed that great connection, and then it came strictly out of their pocket to continue on with that service. Team teaching was a huge magic wand ask from a lot of educators. Why do we only have one educator in a classroom? And I talked to a teacher last week, and she said that she had a very large class, and one of her grade 1 students came up to her and said, "Miss, why is there only one of you and 30 of us?" Like even the students are noticing, why is there such this huge ratio difference between students and teachers? A quiet space for teachers. So the staff room is not always a quiet place or a place where teachers can feel safe and go and kind of recharge if they've had a traumatic event at school, or they've had a really busy day and they need to recharge for 10 or 15 minutes. There isn't necessarily a quiet space for teachers to go to. Actually, I heard this from multiple educators: bring administrators back to the classroom. So if you have a principal or a vice principal who's been out of the classroom for 20 plus years, bring them back into the classroom for a year so that they're back in touch with what's going on in the classroom. Changing the structure of the school year. So there have been schools who have considered removing that 2-month summer break and adding more breaks throughout the school year to kind of spread the love. Having a debrief policy or process for traumatic events or situations so that teachers do have access to that counseling if they need it. And mentor teachers for those who are returning from a leave of absence. So we do have the new teacher induction program in Ontario, but there are teachers who leave for whatever reason, whether it be mental health or otherwise. And then when they come back to work, they're unfamiliar with their class, they're feeling overwhelmed, and they could really benefit from having someone in the room with them to kind of get them back into that classroom environment. So this is just a sampling of what we heard. But the magic wand question is a really important one. So we would love to open it up to a general discussion. What thoughts do you have after hearing kind of what we've presented? If you feel comfortable, you're welcome to share any experiences that you've had. I think one of the things that Susan mentions is that everyone feels like they're an expert on education because we've all been to school. So we would love to open up the dialogue and hear what anyone has to say, or if you want to type something in the chat, feel free to do that as well.
Can I just say one thing, Melissa, while people are thinking or typing, and that is often when our work is very stressful and we are not feeling particularly good at it, our inner critic is saying things like, I'm just not good enough to do this job. The job is too hard for me. And I think bottom line is the job is hard. So I think taking the feelings of self-blame and I'm not reaching the standard out of that equation can be a helpful place to start. So it's not that the job is too hard, or it's not that the job is too hard for you. It's just that the job is hard.
And just to break the ice a bit, Melissa and I were talking this morning because it's an interesting time to have kids in the school system and to have, my husband is a kindergarten teacher, and thinking about what it's going to be like after the break with several provinces removing restrictions. I know New Brunswick is restriction free now. Quebec could be mask free, and Ontario as well. So, thoughts of what that will be like. I know we have a lot of our partner federations and things on today. I'm not sure if you've heard from members how they're feeling about going back, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, perceptions. My whole family had COVID, so we feel not more free per se, but bit of a different perspective, I think, when you've been hit so hard with it in your home. But yeah, my husband will be going back teaching 30 kindergarten students on, next Monday, and with no masks on. And how do we feel about that? And if anyone has any insight to what teachers in their federations might be thinking, it'd be great to hear from you on that too. Oh, we just had an ETFO members also participated in a study looking at the mental health impact and the lack of adequate safety precautions. And the link has been shared in the chat. So thank you very much. Tracy, is that a relatively new study? I don't know if you can let us know.
The study was done by OCOW, the Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario Workers, and the Institute of Work and Health. And it was done in November, December of 2020. So the preliminary results were released last May, and there's still 2 papers that they're looking to publish that are in the peer review process. One is focused on the health and safety aspects, and one actually looks at the mental health impact of the virtual learning and what that stress caused. But there were really alarming results with the impact on anxiety, depression, and burnout. And the researcher called me right before the winter break in 2020, and he was very, very alarmed to see the level of anxiety and depression. And they use a scale that is used by Stats Canada as well. So it definitely it is a reputable survey tool and very concerning. But the question about how people are feeling now, it's a bit mixed. There's some people that feel comfortable, but there is a large number of members that are very anxious. In January, when people were going back to schools, we ended up dealing with quite a few work refusals under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We may see a few of those as well. But the Ministry of Labor is not really that supportive. So it's difficult because they get caught up on who is able to make the rules, and they default to public health, and the government is controlling public health right now. So it's a very difficult situation, and hopefully our members can get through a few more weeks, and we'll see if the rates go back up. Maybe the government will rethink their decision.
Thank you. And that leads into Kim put in a comment too in the chat as well about what Monday will be like. Will there be a divide, and how will the next, like you say, the next few weeks, I think, will be really pivotal, and how things play out, and whether it be masking or even just kindness, as Kim says in the chat comment. I think that's very insightful. And that leads us to Penny's part too, Penny's comment in the chat too about, are kids still happy, healthy, and participating and having those smiles on their faces in the classroom. And, I ask my spouse every day, how was kindergarten today? Was it a good day? And that's, what we want to hear. Teachers are having good days too, students and teachers. While these times are difficult, both teachers and students need to be healthy and happy at work and at school, which for teachers and educators is, of course, school. We have about 2 minutes left. If anyone has any final comments or thoughts or questions about the research, we'd be more than happy to take them before we wrap up. I don't see any final comments or questions. So I'd like you to thank everyone today for taking an hour out of your March break to attend our webinar today. And Tina just put in a comment that's saying she's new to the profession and feeling nervous about entering the classroom as a new teacher. And those fears and nervous, they never go away. I think every September has its own jitters, but it is a very interesting time to be a new teacher, Tina. And I hope, as Melissa said, and maybe that mentorship piece, whether it be formal or informal, can be really helpful as a new educator. So thank you very much for attending our webinar today on behalf of the Healthy Professional Worker Partnership, housed in the University of Ottawa. And thank you to our partner groups, federation groups, teachers, educators, and all of our attendees today for coming. And if you have any questions, we'll stick around for a little bit after the call, but our contact information is here. We are on Twitter, we have a YouTube channel, and we have a website and a Facebook page as well. So thank you very much for attending today, and we appreciate your time during this beautiful March break. Audrey, did you want to stop the recording?